The Ghost of Buckstown Inn by Arnold M. Anderson. Narrated by Paul Beauheart. Several travel-worn drummers sat in the lobby exchanging yarns. It was Rodney Green's turn. He looked wise and began his tale. I don't claim by any means that the belief in ghosts is a general thing in Arkansas, but I do say that I had an experience out there a few years ago. It was late in the fall, and I happened to be in the village of Buckstown, which desecrates a very limited portion of the state. The town is about as small and dirty a place as ever I saw, and the Buckstown Inn is not much above the general character of the place. The region is inhabited by natives who still cling to all sorts of foolish superstitions. The inn, in the antebellum days, was kept by one who was said to be the meanest and most crabbed of mortals. The old demon was as miserly as he was mean. In all his narrow life, he hoarded his filthy lucre with fiendish greed. Report had it also that he had even murdered his patrons in their beds for their money. What the facts actually were, I don't know. But even to this day, the old inn is held in suspicion. A lingering effect of former horrors still clouds its memory. The present proprietor, Bunk Watson, his real name is Bunker, I believe, is an altogether different sort of chap. A southern type, in fact. One of those shiftless, heedless, happy-go-lucky mortals who love strong whiskey and who chews an enormous quid of black tobacco and smokes a corncob pipe at the same time. When the former keeper shuffled off, his property fell to a distant relative, the present keeper, who, with his family, immediately moved in from a neighboring hamlet and took possession. It was well known that the old proprietor had accumulated considerable wealth during his sojourn among the living, but all efforts to discover any treasure upon the premises had failed. Now the idea of ever finding it was practically given up. As far as Bunk was concerned, the matter troubled him little. He had a hard-working wife who ran things the best she could under the circumstances, and saw that his meals were forthcoming at their respective intervals. What more could he wish? Why should he care if there was a treasure buried upon his place? Indeed, it would have been a sore puzzle for him to know what to do with a fortune unless perhaps his wife came to his aid. Among the stories that hovered in the history of the Buckstown Inn was one which involved a ghost. In the room where the former keeper had died, peculiar noises were heard at unearthly hours. Sighing, moaning, and, in fact, all the other indications which point to the existence of ghosts were said to be present. On account of this, the chamber had long since been abandoned. I listened with keen interest to the wonderful tales about the haunted room, and then suddenly resolved to investigate, to sleep in that chamber that very night, and see for myself all that was to be seen. I told Buck of my purpose. He shook his head, shrugged his shoulders, but instead of warning me and offering a flood of protests, as I expected, he merely took his pipe from his mouth, let fly a quart or so of yellowish juice from between a pair of brown-stained lips, and, opening one corner of his wide mouth, lazily called out, "Jane!" His wife appeared, and he intimated that I should settle the matter with the old woman. The prospect of a fee persuaded the wife, and off she went to arrange for my bed in that ill-fated room. At 9 o'clock that evening, I bid the family good night, took my candle, ascended the rickety stairs, and entered the Chamber of Horrors. The atmosphere was heavy and had a peculiar odor that was not at all pleasing. However, I latched the door and was soon in bed. Having propped myself up with pillows, I was prepared to await the coming of the ghost. Overhead, the dusty rafters, which once had experienced the sensation of being whitewashed, but which were now a dirty yellowish color, were hung with a fantastic array of cobwebs. The flickering light of the candle reflected upon the walls and against the ceiling a pyramid of grotesque shapes. And with this effect being continually disturbed by the swaying cobwebs, the whole caused the room to appear rather ghostly after all, and especially so to an imaginative mind. I waited and waited for hours, it seemed, but still no ghost. Perhaps I was afraid of my candlelight, so I blew it out. No sooner had I done this and settled back in bed again than a white hand appeared through the door, then a whole figure. At last the ghost had come, a white and sheeted ghost. It had come right through the door, although it was locked, and now it advanced toward the bed. Raising its long white arm, it pointed a bony finger at me and then commanded, "Come with me." Thereupon it turned to the door, while instantly I jumped out of bed to follow. Some unseen power compelled me to obey. The door flew open, and the ghost led me down the stairs, through long halls into the cellar, through mysterious underground corridors, upstairs again, in and out rooms which I had never dreamed were to be found in that old rambling inn. Finally, through a small door in the rear, we left the house. I was in my sleeping garments, but no matter, I had to follow. The white form, with a slow and measured tread and as silent as death, led the way into the orchard. There, under a tree at the farther end, it pointed to the ground, and in the same ghostly tones before used, said, "Here you will find a great treasure buried." The ghost then disappeared, and I saw it no more. I stood dazed and trembling. Upon recovering my wits, I started to dig, but the chill of the night air and the scantiness of my night robes made such labor impracticable. So I decided to leave some mark to identify the place and come around again at daybreak. I reached up and broke off a limb. Overcome with my night's exertions, I slept the next morning until a loud rapping on my door and a croaking voice warned me that it was noon. I intended to leave BUCKSTOWN Inn that day, but prompted by curiosity and anxious to investigate, I unpacked my gripsack for a comfortable stay. You must understand that this was my first experience with a ghost, and I feared I might never see another. At breakfast, my landlady waited on me in silence, though once I detected her eyes following me with a peculiar expression. She wanted to ask me how I enjoyed the night, but I would not gratify her by volunteering a word. My host was more outspoken. "Reckon you didn't get much sleep," said he with a queer smile. "Did you hear anything?" I asked. "Well, I did, yes," he said with a drawl. "But you didn't disturb me any. I knew you've had trouble when you went in that room to sleep." That afternoon I slipped out to the tree, but to my amazement I found that the twig I had broken from the branches was gone. Finally, I found under the lower trunk of an apple tree an open place from which a small branch had evidently been wrested. But on looking further, I discovered that every apple tree in the orchard had been similarly disfigured. "More mysterious than ever," I said, "but tonight shall decide." That night I pleaded weariness, which no one seemed inclined to question, and sought my couch earlier. "Going to try it again?" asked my host. "Yes, and I'll stay all winter, but what I'll get even with that ghost," I said. That night I kept the candle burning until midnight, when I blew it out. Instantly the room was flooded with a soft light, and at the foot of the bed stood my ghost, the identical ghost of last night. Again the bony finger beckoned, and a sepulchral voice whispered, "Follow me." I sprang from the bed, but the figure darted ahead of me. It flew through the doorway and down the stairs, and I after it. At the foot of the staircase, an unseen hand reached forward and caught my foot, and I fell sprawling headlong. But in a second, I was on my feet and pursuing the ghost. It had gained on me a few yards, but I was quicker, and just as we reached the outside door, I nearly touched its robes. They sent a chill through my frame, and I nearly gave up the pursuit. As it passed through the doorway, it turned and gave me one look, and I caught the same malignant light in its eyes that I remembered from the night before. In the open orchard, I felt sure I could catch it. But my ghost had no intention of allowing me any such opportunity. To my disgust, it darted backward and into the house, slamming the door in my face. In my frenzy of fear and chagrin, I threw myself against the oaken door with such force that its rusty old hinges yielded, and I landed in the big front room of the inn just in time to see the white skirts of the ghost flit up the stairs. Upstairs I flew after it and into an old chamber. There, huddled in a corner, I saw it. In the minute's delay, it had secured a lighted candle, and as I entered, it advanced to daunt me with bony arm upraised to a great height. "Caught!" I cried, throwing my arms around the figure, and I had made the acquaintance of a real live ghost. The white robes fell, and I saw revealed my hostess of BUCKSTOWN Inn. Next morning, when I threatened to call the police, she confessed to me that she masqueraded as a ghost to draw visitors to the out-of-the-way old place, and that she found its tale of being haunted highly profitable to her. End of story. If you're enjoying this reading from Friendly Frog Press, please make sure to subscribe and hit that like button. The Spirit's Whisper by J. Sheridan Le Fanu. Narrated by Paul Beauheart. Yes, I have been haunted. Haunted so fearfully that for some little time I thought myself insane. I was no raving maniac. I mixed in society as heretofore, although perhaps a trifle more grave and taciturn than usual. I pursued my daily avocations. I employed myself even on literary work. To all appearance, I was one of the sanest of the sane, and yet all the while I considered myself the victim of such strange delusions that, in my own mind, I fancied my senses, in one sense in particular, so far erratic and beyond my own control that I was, in real truth, a madman. How far I was then insane it must be for others, who hear my story, to decide. My hallucinations have long since left me, and at all events, I am now as sane as I suppose most men are. My first attack came one afternoon when, being in a listless and idle mood, I had risen from my work and was amusing myself with speculating at my window on the different personages who were passing before me. At that time I occupied apartments in the Brompton Road. Perhaps there is no thoroughfare in London where the ordinary passengers are of so varied a description or high life and low life mingle in so perpetual a medley. South Kensington carriages there jostle costermongers' carts. The clerk in the public office, returning to his suburban dwelling, brushes the laborer coming from his work on the never-ending modern constructions in the new district. And the ladies of some of the surrounding squares flaunt the most gigantic of chignons and the most exuberant of motley dresses before the envying eyes of the ragged girls with their vegetable baskets. There was, as usual, plenty of material for observation and conjecture in the passengers, and their characters or destinations from my window on that day. Yet, I was not in the right cue for the thorough enjoyment of my favorite amusement. I was in a rather melancholy mood. Somehow or other, I don't know why, my memory had reverted to a pretty woman whom I had not seen for many years. She had been my first love. I loved her with a boyish passion as genuine as it was intense. I thought my heart would have broken, and I certainly talked seriously of dying, when she formed an attachment to an ill-conditioned, handsome young adventurer, and, on her family objecting to such an alliance, eloped with him. I had never seen the fellow, against whom, however, I cherished a hatred almost as intense as my passion for the infatuated girl who had flown from her home for his sake. We had heard of her being on the continent with her husband, and learned that the man's shifty life had eventually taken him to the East. For some years nothing more had been heard of the poor girl. It was a melancholy history, and its memory ill-disposed me for amusement. A sigh was probably just escaping my lips with the half-articulated words, "Poor Julia," when my eyes fell on a man passing before my window. There was nothing particularly striking about him. He was tall, with fine features, and a long fair beard contrasting somewhat with his bronzed complexion. I had seen many of our officers on the return from the Crimea look much the same. Still, the man's aspect gave me a shuddering feeling. I didn't know why. At the same moment, a whispering, low voice uttered aloud in my ear the words, "It is he!" I turned, startled. There was no one near me, no one in the room. There was no fancy in the sound. I'd heard the words with painful distinctness. I ran to the door, opened it, not a sound on the staircase, not a sound in the whole house, nothing but the hum from the streets. I came back and sat down. It was no use reasoning with myself. I had the ineffaceable conviction that I had heard the voice. Then first the idea crossed my mind that I might be the victim of hallucinations. Yes, it must have been so, for now I recalled to mind that the voice had been that of my poor lost Julia, and at the moment I heard it, I had been dreaming of her. I questioned my own state of health. I was well, at least I had been so. I felt fully assured up to that moment. Now a feeling of chilliness and numbness and faintness had crept over me. A cold sweat was on my forehead. I tried to shake off this feeling by bringing back my thoughts to some other subject, but involuntarily, as it were, I again uttered the words, "Poor Julia," aloud. At the same time, a deep and heavy sigh, almost a groan, was distinctly audible close by me. I sprang up. I was alone, quite alone. It was, once more, an hallucination. By degrees, the first painful impression wore away. Some days had passed, and I had begun to forget my singular delusion. When my thoughts revert to it, the recollection was dismissed as that of a ridiculous fancy. One afternoon I was in the Strand, coming from Charing Cross, when I was once more overcome by that peculiar feeling of cold and numbness which I had before experienced. The day was warm and bright and genial, and yet I positively shivered. I had scarce time to interrogate my own strange sensations when a man went by me rapidly. How was it that I recognized him at once as the individual who had only passed my window so casually on that morning of the hallucination? I don't know, and I was aware that this man was the tall, fair passerby of the Brompton Road. At the same moment, the voice I had previously heard whispered distinctly in my ear the words, "Follow him!" I stood stupefied. The usual throngs of indifferent persons were hurrying past me in that crowded thoroughfare, but I felt convinced that not one of these had spoken to me. I remained transfixed for a moment. I was bent on a manner of business in the contrary direction to the individual I had remarked, and so, although with unsteady step, I endeavored to proceed on my way. Again that voice said, still more emphatically in my ear, "Follow him!" I stopped involuntarily, and a third time, "Follow him!" I told myself that the sound was a delusion, a cheat of my senses. Yet I could not resist the spell. I turned to follow. Quickening my pace, I soon came up with this tall, fair man, and unremarked by him, I followed him. Whither was this foolish pursuit to lead me? It was useless to ask myself the question. I was impelled to follow. I was not destined to go very far, however. Before long, the object of my absurd chase entered a well-known insurance office. I stopped at the door of the establishment. I had no business within. Why should I continue to follow? Had I not already been making a sad fool of myself by my ridiculous conduct? These were my thoughts as I stood heated by my quick walk. Yes, heated, and yet once more came the sudden chill. Once more that same low but now awful voice spoke in my ear. "Go in," it said. I endeavored to resist the spell, and I felt that resistance was in vain. Fortunately, as it seemed to me, the thought crossed my mind that an old acquaintance was a clerk in that same insurance office. I had not been the fellow for a great length of time, and I never had been very intimate with him. But here was a pretext, and so I went in and inquired for Clement Stanley. My acquaintance came forward. He was very busy, he said. I invented on the spur of the moment some excuse of the most frivolous and absurd nature, as far as I can recollect, for my intrusion. "By the way," I said, as I turned to take my leave, although my question was by the way of nothing at all, "who was that tall, fair man who just now entered the office?" "Oh, that fellow?" was the indifferent reply. "Captain Campbell, or Kenton, or some such name. I forget what. He has gone in before the board, insured his wife's life, and she is dead. Comes for a settlement, I suppose." There was nothing more to be gained, and so I left the office. As soon as I came without into the scorching sunlight, again the same feeling of cold, again the same voice. "Wait!" Was I going mad? More and more the conviction forced itself upon me that I was decidedly a monomaniac already. I felt my pulse. It was agitated and yet not feverish. I was determined not to give way to this absurd hallucination. And yet, so far was I out of my senses that my will was no longer my own. Resolved as I was to go, I listened to the dictates of that voice and waited. What was it to me that this Campbell or Kenton had insured his wife's life, that she was dead, and that he wanted a settlement of his claim? Obviously nothing. I yet waited. So strong was the spell on me that I had no longer any count of time. I had no consciousness whether the period was long or short, that I stood there near the door, heedless of all the throng that passed, gazing on vacancy. The fiercest of policemen might have told me to move on. I should not have stirred, spite of all the terrors of the station. The individual came forth. He paid no heed to me. Why should he? What was I to him? This time I needed no warning voice to bid me follow. I was a madman. I could not resist the impulses of my madness. It was thus, at least, I reasoned with myself. I followed into Regent Street. The object of my insensate observation lingered and looked around as if in expectation. Presently, a fine-looking woman, somewhat extravagantly dressed, and obviously not a lady, advanced toward him on the pavement. At the sight of her, he quickened his step and joined her rapidly. I shuddered again, but this time a sort of dread was mingled with that strange shivering. I knew what was coming, and it came. Again, that voice in my ear. "Look and remember," it said. I passed the man and woman as they stopped at their first meeting. "Is all right, George?" said the female. "All right, my girl," was the reply. I looked. An evil smile, as if of wicked triumph, was on the man's face, I thought. And on the woman's? I looked at her, and I remembered. I could not be mistaken. In spite of her change in manner, dress, and appearance, it was Mary Sims. This woman, some years before, when she was still very young, had been a sort of humble companion to my mother. A simple-minded, honest girl, we thought her. Sometimes I had fancied that she had paid me, in a sly way, a marked attention. I had been foolish enough to be flattered by her stealthy glances and her sighs, but I had treated these little demonstrations of partiality as due only to a silly girlish fancy. Mary Sims, however, had come to grief in our household. She had been detected in the abstraction of sundry jewels and penny ornaments. The morning after discovery, she had left the house, and we had heard of her no more. As these recollections passed rapidly through my mind, I looked behind me. The couple had turned back. I turned to follow again, and, in spite of carriages and cabs, and shouts and oaths of driver, I took the middle of the street in order to pass the man and woman at a little distance, unobserved. No, I was not mistaken. The woman was Mary Sims, though without any trace of all her former simple-minded airs. Mary Sims, no longer in her humble attire, but flaunting in all the finery of overdone fashion. She wore an air of reckless joyousness in her face, and yet, in spite of that, I pitied her. It was clear she had fallen on the evil ways of bettered fortune, better to last for the worse. I had an excuse now, in my own mind, for my continued pursuit, without deeming myself an utter madman. The excuse of curiosity to know the destiny of one with whom I had been formerly familiar, and in whom I had taken an interest. Presently, the game I was hunting down stopped at the door of the Grand Café. After a little discussion, they entered. It was a public place of entertainment. There was no reason why I should not enter also. I found my way to the first floor. They were already seated at a table, Mary holding the cart in her hand. They were about to dine. Why should I not dine there too? There was but one little objection. I had an engagement to dinner. But the strange impulse which overpowered me and seemed leading me on step by step, spite of myself, quickly overruled all the dictates of propriety toward my intended hosts. Could I not send a prettily devised apology? I glided past the couple, with my head averted, seeking a table, and I was unobserved by my old acquaintance. I was too agitated to eat, but I made a semblance and little heeded the air of surprise and almost disgust on the bewildered face of the waiter as he bore away the barely touched dishes. I was in a very fever of impatience and doubt what next to do. They still sat on, in evident enjoyment of their meal and their constant draughts of sparkling wine. My impatience was becoming almost unbearable when the man at last rose. The woman seemed to have uttered some expostulation, for he turned at the door and said somewhat harshly aloud, "Nonsense, only one game and I shall be back. The waiter will give you a paper, a magazine, something to while away the time." He left the room for the billiard table, as I surmised. Now was my opportunity. After a little hesitation, I rose and planted myself abruptly in the vacant seat before the woman. "Mary," I said. She started with a little exclamation of alarm and dropped the paper she had held. She knew me at once. "Master John?" she exclaimed, using the familiar term still given me when I was long past boyhood. And then, after a lengthened gaze, she turned away her head. I was embarrassed at first how to address her. "Mary," I said at last, "I am grieved to see you thus." "Why should you be grieved for me?" she retorted, looking at me sharply and speaking in a tone of impatient anger. "I am happy as I am." "I don't believe you," I replied. She again turned away her head. "Mary," I pursued, "can you doubt that, spite of all, I have still a strong interest in the companion of my youth?" She looked at me almost mournfully, but did not speak. At that moment I probably grew pale, for suddenly that chilly fit seized me again, and my forehead became clammy. That voice sounded again in my ear. "Speak of him," were the words it uttered. Mary gazed at me with surprise, and I was assured that she had not heard that voice, so plain to me. She evidently mistook the nature of my visible emotion. "Oh, Master John," she stammered, with tears gathering in her eyes, reverting again to that name of bygone times. "If you had loved me then, if you had consoled my true affection with one word of hope, one look of loving kindness, if you had not spurned and crushed me, I should not have been what I am now." I was about to make some answer to this burst of unforgotten passion when the voice came again. "Speak of him." "You have loved others since," I remarked with a coldness which seemed cruel to myself. "You love him now." And I nodded my head toward the door by which the man had disappeared. "Do I?" she said with a bitter smile. "Perhaps. Who knows?" "And yet no good can come to you from a connection with that man," I pursued. "Why not? He adores me, and he is free," was her answer, given with a little triumphant air. "Yes," I said, "I know he is free. He has lately lost his wife. He has made good his claim to the sum for which he insured her life." Mary grew deadly pale. "How did you learn this? What do you know of him?" she stammered. I had no reply to give. She scanned my face anxiously for some time, then in a low voice she added, "What do you suspect?" I was still silent and only looked at her fixedly. "You do not speak," she pursued nervously. "Why do you not speak? Ah, you know more than you would say. Master John, Master John, you might set my tortured mind at rest and clear or confirm those doubts which will come into my poor head, spite of myself. Speak out. Oh, do speak out." "Not here. It is impossible," I replied, looking around. The room, as the hour advanced, was becoming more thronged with guests, and the full tables gave a pretext for my reticence, when in truth I had nothing to say. "Will you come and see me, will you?" she asked with earnest entreaty. I nodded my head. "Have you a pocketbook? I will write you my address. You will come. Yes, I'm sure you will come," she said in an agitated way. I handed her my pocketbook and pencil. She wrote rapidly. "Between the hours of 3 and 5, she whispered, looking uneasily at the door. "He is sure not to be at home." I rose. Mary held out her hand to me, then withdrew it hastily with an air of shame, and the tears sprang into her eyes again. I left the room hurriedly, and met her companion on the stairs. That same evening, in the solitude of my own room, I pondered over the little event of the day. I calmed down from my state of excitement. The living apparition of Mary Sims occupied my mind almost to the exclusion of the terrors of the ghostly voice which had haunted me, and my own fears of coming insanity. In truth, what was that man to me? Nothing. What did his doings matter to such a perfect stranger as myself? Nothing. His connection with Mary Sims was our only link. And what should that affect me? Nothing again. I debated with myself whether it were not foolish of me to comply with my youthful companion's request to visit her, whether it were not imprudent in me to take any further interest in the lost woman, whether there were not even danger in seeking to penetrate mysteries which were no concern of mine. The resolution to which I came pleased me, and I said aloud, "No, I will not go." At the same moment came again the voice, like an awful echo to my words, "Go." It came so suddenly and so imperatively, almost without any previous warning of the usual shudder, that the shock was more than I could bear. I believe I fainted. I found myself, when I came to consciousness, in my armchair, cold and numb, and my candles had almost burned down into their sockets. The next morning I was really ill. A sort of low fever seemed to have prostrated me, and I would have willingly seized so valid a reason for disobeying, at least for that day, for some days perhaps, the injunction of that ghostly voice. But all that morning it never left me. My fearful chilly fit was of constant recurrence, and the words, "Go, go, go," were murmured so perpetually in my ears. The sound was one of such urgent entreaty that all force of will gave way completely. Had I remained in that lone room, I should have gone wholly mad. As yet, to my own feelings, I was but partially out of my senses. I dressed hastily, and, I scarce know how. By no effort of my own will, it seemed to me, I was in the open air. The address of Mary Sims was in a street not far from my own suburb. Without any power of reasoning, I found myself before the door of the house. I knocked and asked a slipshod girl who opened the door to me for Miss Sims. She knew no such person. The brief shrill colloquy with some female in the back parlor, and, on coming back, was about to shut the door in my face, when a voice from above, the voice of her I sought, called down the stairs, "Let the gentleman come up." I was allowed to pass. In the front drawing room I found Mary Sims. "They do not know me under that name," she said with a mournful smile, and again extended, then withdrew her hand. "Sit down," she went on to say, after a nervous pause. "I am alone now. Told I adjure you, if you have still one latent feeling of old kindness for me, explain your words of yesterday to me." I muttered something to the effect that I had no explanation to give. No words could be truer. I had not the slightest conception what to say. "Yes, I'm sure you have. You must, you will," pursued Mary excitedly. "You have some knowledge of that matter." "What matter?" I asked. "Why, the insurance," she replied impatiently. "You know well what I mean. My mind has been distracted about it. In spite of myself, terrible suspicions have forced themselves on me. No, I don't mean that," she cried, suddenly checking herself and changing her tone. "Don't heed what I said. It was madness in me to say what I did, but do tell me all you know." The request was a difficult one to comply with, for I knew nothing. It is impossible to say what might have been the end of this strange interview, in which I began to feel myself an unwilling impostor. But suddenly Mary started. "The noise of the latchkey in the lock," she cried, alarmed. "He has returned. He must not see you. You must come another time. Here, be quick. I'll manage him." And before I could utter another word, she had pushed me into the back drawing room and closed the door. A man's step on the stairs, then voices. The man was begging Mary to come out with him, as the day was so fine. She excused herself. He would hear no refusal. At last she appeared to consent on condition that the man would assist at her toilet. There was a little laughter, almost hysterical on the part of Mary, whose voice evidently quivered with trepidation. Presently both mounted the upper stairs. Then the thought struck me that I had left my hat in the front room, sufficient cause for the woman's alarm. I opened the door cautiously, seized my hat, and was about to steal down the stairs when I was again spellbound by that numb cold. "Stay," said the voice. I staggered back to the other room with my hat and closed the door. Presently the couple came down. Mary was probably relieved by discovering that my hat was no longer there, and surmised that I had departed, for I heard her laughing as they went down the lower flight. Then I heard them leave the house. I was alone in that back drawing room. Why? What did I want there? I was soon to learn. I felt a chill, invisible presence near me, and the voice said, "Search!" The room belonged to the common representative class of back drawing rooms and apartments of the better kind. The only one unfamiliar piece of furniture was an old Indian cabinet, and my eye naturally fell on that. As I stood and looked at it with a strange, unaccountable feeling of fascination, again came the voice, "Search!" I shuddered and obeyed. The cabinet was firmly locked. There was no power of opening it except by burglarious infraction. But still the voice said, "Search!" A thought suddenly struck me, and I turned the cabinet from its position against the wall. Behind, the woodwork had rotted, and many portions fallen away, so that the inner drawers were visible. What could my ghostly monitor mean, that I should open those drawers? I would not do such a deed of petty treachery. I turned defiantly, and addressing myself to the invisible, as if it were a living creature by my side, I cried, "I must not, will not, do such an act of baseness." The voice replied, "Search!" I might have known that, in my state of what I deemed insanity, resistance was in vain. I grasped the most accessible drawer from behind and pulled it toward me. Uppermost within it lay letters. They were addressed to Captain Cameron, Captain George Cameron. That name! The name of Julia's husband, the man with whom she had eloped, for it was he who was the object of my pursuit. My shuddering fit became so strong that I could scarce hold the papers, and "Search!" was repeated in my ear. Below the letters lay a small book and a limp black cover. I opened this book with trembling hand. It was filled with manuscript, Julia's well-known handwriting. "Read," muttered the voice. I read. There were long entries by poor Julia of her daily life, complaints of her husband's unkindness, neglect, then cruelty. I turned to the last pages. Her hand had grown very feeble now, and she was very ill. George seems kinder now, she wrote. He brings me all my medicines with his own hand. Later on. I am dying. I know I am dying. He has poisoned me. I saw him last night through the curtains pour something in my cup. I saw it in his evil eye. I would not drink. I would drink no more, but I feel that I must die. These were the last words. Below were written in a man's bold hand the words, Poor fool. The sudden revelation of poor Julia's death and dying thoughts unnerved me quite. I grew colder in my whole frame than ever. Take it, said her voice. I took the book, pushed back the cabinet into its place against the wall, and leaving that fearful room, stole down the stairs with trembling limbs, and left the house with all the feelings of a guilty thief. For some days I pursued my poor lost Julia's diary again and again. The whole revelation of her sad life and sudden death led but to one conclusion. She had died of poison by the hands of her unworthy husband. He had insured her life, and then it seemed evident to me that Mary Sims had vaguely shared suspicions of the same foul deed. On my own mind came conviction. But what could I do next? How bring this evil man to justice? What proof would be deemed to exist in those writings? I was bewildered, weak, irresolute. Like Hamlet, I shrank back and temporized. But I was not feigning madness. My madness seemed but all too real for me. During all this period, the wailing of that wretched voice in my ear was almost incessant. Oh, I must have been mad. I wandered about restlessly like the haunted thing I had become. One day I had come unconsciously and without purpose into Oxford Street. My troubled thoughts were suddenly broken in upon by the solicitations of a beggar. With a heart hardened against begging impostors, and under the influence of the shock rudely given to me by absorbing dreams, I answered more hardly than was my wont. The man heaved a heavy sigh and sobbed forth, Then heaven help me. I caught sight of him before he turned away. He was a ghastly object, with fever in his hollow eyes and sunken cheeks, and fever on his dry, chapped lips. But I knew, or fancied I knew, the tricks of the trade, and I was obdurate. Why, I asked myself, should the cold shudder come over me at such a moment? But it was so strong on me as to make me shake all over. It came, that maddening voice. Succor, it said now. I had become so accustomed already to address the ghostly voice that I cried aloud, Why, Julia, why? I saw people laughing in my face at this strange cry, and I turned in the direction in which the beggar had gone. I just caught sight of him as he was tottering down a street towards Soho. I determined to have pity for this once, and followed the poor man. He led me on through I know not what streets. His steps was hurried now. In one street I lost sight of him, but I felt convinced he must have turned into a dingy court. I made inquiries, but for a time received only rude, jeering answers from the rough men and women whom I questioned. At last a little girl informed me that I must mean the strange man who lodged in the garret of a house she pointed out to me. It was an old dilapidated building, and I had much repugnance on entering it. But again, I was no master of my will. I mounted some creaking stairs to the top of the house until I could go no further. A shattered door was open. I entered a wretched garret. The object of my search lay now on a bundle of rags on the bare floor. He opened his wild eyes as I approached. I have come to succor, I said, using unconsciously the word of the voice. What ails you? Ails me, gasped the man. Hunger, starvation, fever. I was horrified. Hurrying to the top of the stairs, I shouted till I had roused the attention of an old woman. I gave her money to bring me food and brandy, promising her a recompense for her trouble. Have you no friends? I asked the wretched man as I returned. None, he said feebly. Then, as the fever rose in his eyes and even flushed his pallid face, he said excitedly, I had a master once, one I periled my soul for. He knows I am dying, but spite of all my letters, he will not come. He wants me dead. He wants me dead. His wish is coming to pass now. Cannot I find him? Bring him here? I asked. The man stared at me, shook his head, and at last, as if collecting his faculties with much exertion, muttered, Yes, it is the last hope. Perhaps you may. And I can be revenged on him at least. Yes, revenged. I've threatened him already. The fellow laughed a wild laugh. Control yourself, I urged, kneeling by his side. Give me his name, his address. Captain George Cameron, he gasped and then fell back. Captain George Cameron, I cried. Speak, what of him? But the man's senses seemed gone. He only muttered incoherently. The old woman returned with the food and spirits. I found one honest creature in that foul region. I gave her money, provide her more if she would bring a doctor. She departed on her new errand. I raised the man's head, moistened his lips with the brandy, and then poured some of the spirit down his throat. He gulped at it eagerly and opened his eyes, but he still raved incoherently. I did not do it. It was he. He made me buy the poison. He dared not risk the danger himself, the coward. I knew what he meant to do with it, and yet I did not speak. I was her murderer, too. Poor Mrs. Cameron, poor Mrs. Cameron. Do you forgive? Can you forgive? The man screamed aloud and stretched out his arms as if to fright away a phantom. I had drunken every word, knew the meaning of those broken accents well. Could I have found at last the means of bringing justice on the murderer's head? But the man was raving in a delirium, and I was obliged to hold him with all my strength. A step on the stairs. Could it be the medical man I had sent for? That would be indeed a blessing. A man entered. It was Cameron. He came in jauntily with the words, How now, Sanders, you rascal? What more do you want to get out of me? He started at the sight of a stranger. I rose from my kneeling posture like an accusing spirit. I struggled for calm, but passion beyond my control mastered me. And was I not a madman? I seized him by the throat with the words, Murderer! Poisoner! Where is Julia? He shook me off violently. And who the devil are you, sir? He cried. That murdered woman's cousin. I rushed at him again. Lying hound, he shouted and grappled me. His strength was far beyond mine. He had his hand on my throat. A crimson darkness was in my eyes. I could not see. I could not hear. There was a torrent of sound pouring in my ears. Suddenly his grasp relaxed. When I recovered my sight, I saw the murderer struggling with the fever-stricken man, who had risen from the floor and seized him from behind. This unexpected diversion saved my life, but the ex-groom was soon thrown back on the ground. Captain George Cameron, I cried, kill me, but you will only heap another murder on your head. He advanced on me with something glittering in his hand. Without a word, he came and stabbed at me, but at the same moment I darted at him with a heavy blow. What followed was too confused for clear remembrance. I saw, no, I will say I fancied that I saw, the dim form of Julia Staunton standing between me and her vile husband. Did he see the vision too? I cannot say. He reeled back and fell heavily to the floor. Maybe it was only my blow that felled him. Then came confusion, a dream of a crowd of people, policemen, muttered accusations. I had fainted from the wound in my arm. Captain George Cameron was arrested. Saunders recovered and lived long enough to be the principal witness on his trial. The murderer was found guilty. Poor Julia's diary, too, which I had abstracted, told fearfully against him, but he contrived to escape the gallows. He had managed to conceal poison on his person and was found dead in his cell. Mary Sims I never saw again. I once received a little scrawl. I am at peace now, Master John. God bless you. I've had no more hallucinations since that time. The voice has never come again. I found out poor Julia's grave, and as I stood and wept by its side, the cold shudder came over me for the last time. Who shall tell me whether I was once really mad, or whether I was not? End of story. From the Tomb by E.C. Waggener, narrated by Paul Beauheart. The guests filed slowly into the hotel's great dining hall and took their places. The waiters began to serve them leisurely, to give the tardy ones time to arrive, and to save themselves the bother of bringing back the courses. And the old bathers, the yearly habitués, with whom the season was far advanced, kept a close watch on the door each time it opened, hoping for the coming of new faces. New faces, the single distraction of all pleasure resorts. We go to dinner chiefly to canvass the daily arrivals, to wonder who they are, what they do, and what they think. A restless desire seems to have taken possession of us, a longing for pleasant adventures, for friendly acquaintances perhaps, for possible lovers. In this elbow-to-elbow life, our unknown neighbors become of paramount importance. Curiosity is piqued, sympathy on the alert, and the social instinct doubly active. We have hatreds for a week, friendships for a month, and view all men with the special eyes of watering-place intimacy. Sometimes during an hour's chat after dinner under the trees of the park, where ripples a healing spring, we discover men of superior intellect and surprising merit, and a month later have wholly forgotten these new friends, so charming at first sight. There, too, more especially than elsewhere, serious and lasting ties are formed. We see each other every day and learn to know each other very soon. And in the affection that springs up so rapidly between us, there is mingled much of the sweet abandon of old and tried intimates. And later on, how tender are the memories cherished of the first hours of this friendship, of the first communion in which the soul came to light, of the first glances that question responded to the secret thoughts and interrogatories the lips have not dared yet to utter, of the first cordial confidence and delicious sensation of opening one's heart to someone who has seemed to lay bare to you his own. The very dullness of the hours, as it were, the monotony of days all alike, but renders more complete the rapid budding and blooming of friendship's flower. That evening, then, as on every evening, we awaited the appearance of unfamiliar faces. There came only two, but very peculiar ones, those of a man and a woman, father and daughter. They seemed to have stepped from the pages of some weird legend, and yet there was an attraction about them, albeit an unpleasant one, that made me set them down at once as the victims of some fatality. The father was tall, spare, a little bent, with hair blanched white, too white for a still young countenance, and in his manner and about his person the sedate austerity of carriage that bespeaks the Puritan. The daughter was, possibly, some 24 or 25 years of age. She was very slight, emaciated, her exceedingly pale countenance bearing a languid, spiritless expression, one of those people whom we sometimes encounter, apparently too weak for the cares and tasks of life, too feeble to move or do the things that we must do every day. Nevertheless, the girl was pretty, with the ethereal beauty of an apparition. It was she, undoubtedly, who came for the benefit of the waters. They chanced to be placed at table immediately opposite to me, and I was not long in noticing that the father, too, had a strange affection, something wrong about the nerves, it seemed. Whenever he was going to reach for anything, his hand, with a jerky twitch, described a sort of fluttering zigzag before he was able to grasp what he was after. Soon the motion disturbed me so much I kept my head turned in order not to see it, but not before I had also observed that the young girl kept her glove on her left hand while she ate. Dinner ended. I went out as usual for a turn in the grounds belonging to the establishment, a sort of park, I might say, stretching clear to the little station of Auvergne, Châtel-Guyon, nestling in a gorge at the foot of the high mountain from which flowed the sparkling, bubbling springs, hot from the furnace of an ancient volcano. Beyond us there, the domes, small extinct craters of which Châtel-Guyon is the starting point, raised their serrated heads above the long chain, while beyond the domes came two distinct regions, one of them needle-like peaks, the other of bold, precipitous mountains. It was very warm that evening, and I contented myself with pacing to and fro under the rustling trees, gazing at the mountains and listening to the strains of the band pouring from the casino, situated on a knoll that overlooked the grounds. Presently I perceived the father and daughter coming toward me with slow steps. I bowed to them in that pleasant continental fashion with which one always salutes his hotel companions. The gentleman halted at once. "Pardon me, sir," said he, "but may I ask you if you can direct us to a short walk, easy and pretty, if possible?" "Certainly," I answered, and offered to lead them myself to the valley through which the swift river flows, a deep narrow cleft between two great declivities, rocky and wooded. They accepted, and as we walked, we naturally discussed the virtue of the mineral waters. They had, as I had surmised, come there on his daughter's account. "She has a strange malady," said he, "the seat of which her physicians cannot determine. She suffers from the most inexplicable nervous symptoms. Sometimes they declare her ill of a heart disease, sometimes of a liver complaint, again of a spinal trouble. At present they attribute it to the stomach, that great motor and regulator of the body. This protean disease of 1,000 forms, 1,000 modes of attack, is why we are here. I myself think it is her nerves. In case it is sad." This reminded me of his own jerking hand. "It may be hereditary," said I. "Your own nerves are a little disturbed, are they not?" "Mine," he answered tranquilly, "not at all. I have always possessed the calmest nerves." Then suddenly, as if bethinking himself, "For this," touching his hand, "is not nerves, but the result of a shock, a terrible shock that I suffered once. Fancy it, sir, this child of mine has been buried alive." I could find nothing to say. I was dumb with surprise. "Yes," he continued, "buried alive. But hear the story. It is not long. For some time past, Juliet had seemed affected with a disordered action of the heart. We were finally certain that the trouble was organic and feared the worst. One day it came. She was brought in lifeless, dead. She had fallen dead while walking in the garden. Physicians came in haste, but nothing could be done. She was gone. For 2 days and nights I watched beside her myself, and with my own hands placed her in her coffin, which I followed to the cemetery and saw placed in the family vault. This was in the country in the province of Lorraine. It had been my wish, too, that she should be buried in her jewels, bracelets, necklaces, and rings, all presents that I had given her in her first ball dress. You can imagine, sir, the state of my heart in returning home. She was all that I had left. My wife had been dead for many years. I returned, in truth, half mad, shut myself alone in my room, and fell into my chair dazed, unable to move, merely a miserable, breathing wreck. Soon my old valet, Prosper, who would help me place Juliet in her coffin and lay her away for her last sleep, came in noiselessly to see if he could not induce me to eat. I shook my head, answering nothing. He persisted. "Monsieur is wrong. This will make him ill. Will monsieur allow me, then, to put him to bed?" "No, no," I answered. "Let me alone." He yielded and withdrew. How many hours passed, I do not know. What a night! What a night! It was very cold. My fire of logs had long since burned out in the great fireplace, and the wind, a wintry blast, charged with an icy frost, howled and screamed about the house and strained at my windows with a curiously sinister sound. Long hours, I say, rolled by. I sat still where I had fallen, prostrated, overwhelmed, my eyes wide open, but my body strengthless, dead, my soul drowned in despair. Suddenly the great bell gave a loud peal. I gave such a leap that my chair cracked under me. The slow, solemn sound rang through the empty house. I looked at the clock. It was 2 a.m. Who could be coming at such an hour? Twice again the bell pulled sharply. The servants would never answer, perhaps never hear it. I took up a candle and made my way to the door. I was about to demand, "Who is there?" but ashamed of the weakness, nerved myself and drew back the bolts. My heart throbbed, my pulse beat. I threw back the panel brusquely, and there, in the darkness, saw a shape like a phantom, dressed in white. I recoiled, speechless with anguish, stammering, Who are you?" A voice answered, "It is I, father." It was my child, Juliet. Truly, I thought myself mad. I shuddered, shrinking backward before the spectre as it advanced, gesticulating with my hand to ward off the apparition. It is that gesture which has never left me. Again the phantom spoke. "Father, father, see, I am not dead. Someone came to rob me of my jewels. They cut off my finger. The flowing blood revived me." And I saw then that she was covered with blood. I fell to my knees, panting, sobbing, laughing, all in one. As soon as I regained my senses, but still so bewildered I scarcely comprehended the happiness that had come to me, I took her in my arms, carried her to her room, and rang frantically for Prosper to rekindle the fire, bring a warm drink for her, and go for the doctor. He came running, entered, gazed a moment at my daughter in the chair, gave a gasp of fright and horror, and fell back dead. It was he who had opened the vault, who had wounded and robbed my child, then abandoned her, for he could not efface all trace of his deed, and he had not even taken the trouble to return the coffin to its niche. Sure, besides of not being suspected by me, who trusted him so filially, we are truly very unfortunate people, monsieur. He was silent. Meanwhile, the night had come on, enveloping in the gloom the still and solitary little valley. A sort of mysterious dread seemed to fall upon me in presence of these strange beings. This corpse come to life, and this father with his painful gestures. "Let us return," said I. "The night has grown chill." And still in silence, we retraced our steps back to the hotel, and I shortly afterward returned to the city. I lost all further knowledge of the two peculiar visitors to my favorite summer resort. End of story. Dick and the Devil by J. Sheridan Le Fanu, narrated by Paul Beauheart. About 30 years ago, I was selected by two rich old maids to visit a property in that part of Lancashire which lies near the famous forest of Pendle, with which Mr. Ainsworth's Lancashire Witches has made us so pleasantly familiar. My business was to make partition of a small property, including a house and domain to which they had, a long time before, succeeded as co-heiresses. The last 40 miles of my journey I was obliged to post, chiefly by crossroads little known and less frequented, presenting scenery often extremely interesting and pretty. The picturesqueness of the landscape was enhanced by the season, the beginning of September, at which I was traveling. I had never been in this part of the world before. I'm told it is now a great deal less wild and consequently less beautiful. At the inn where I had stopped for a relay of horses and some dinner, for it was then past 5 o'clock, I found the host, a hale old fellow of 65, as he told me, a man of easy and garrulous benevolence, willing to accommodate his guest with any amount of talk, which the slightest tap sufficed to set flowing on any subject you pleased. I was curious to learn something about Barwick, which was the name of the domain and house I was going to. There was no inn within some miles of it. I had written to the steward to put me up there, the best way he could for a night. The host of the Three Nuns, which was the sign under which he entertained wayfarers, had not a great deal to tell. It was 20 years or more since old Squire Bowes died, and no one had lived in the hall ever since, except the gardener and his wife. Tom Windsor will be as old a man as myself, but he's a bit taller, and not so much in flesh quite, said the fat innkeeper. But there were stories about the house, I repeated, that they said prevented tenants from coming into it. Old wives' tales, many years ago that will be, sir. I forgot 'em. I forget 'em all. Oh yes, there always will be. When a house is left so, foolish folk will always be talking. But I hadn't heard a word about it this 20 year. It was vain trying to pump him. The old landlord of the Three Nuns, for some reason, did not choose to tell tales of Barwick Hall. If he really did, as I suspected, remember them. I paid my reckoning and resumed my journey, well pleased with the good cheer of that old-world inn, but a little disappointed. We had been driving for more than an hour when we began to cross a wild common, and I knew that, this past, a quarter of an hour would bring me to the door of Barwick Hall. The peat and firs were pretty soon left behind. We were again in the wooded scenery that I enjoyed so much, so entirely natural and pretty, and so little disturbed by traffic of any kind. I was looking from the shay window and soon detected the object of which, for some time, my eye had been in search. Barwick Hall was a large, quaint house of that cagework fashion known as black and white, in which the bars and angles of an oak framework contrast, black as ebony, with the white plaster that overspreads the masonry built into its interstices. This steep-roofed Elizabethan house stood in the midst of park-like grounds of no great extent, but rendered imposing by the noble stature of the old trees that now cast their lengthening shadows eastward over the sward from the declining sun. The park wall was gray with age, and in many places laden with ivy. In deep gray shadow that contrasted with the dim fires of evening reflected on the foliage above it, in a gentle hollow, stretched a lake that looked cold and black, and seemed, as it were, to skulk from observation with a guilty knowledge. I had forgot that there was a lake at Barwick, but the moment this caught my eye, like the cold polish of a snake in the shadow, my instinct seemed to recognize something dangerous, and I knew that the lake was connected, I could not remember how, with the story I had heard of this place in my boyhood. I drove up a grass-grown avenue under the boughs of these noble trees, whose foliage, dyed in autumnal red and yellow, returned the beams of the western sun gorgeously. We drew up at the door. I got out, had a good look at the front of the house. It was a large and melancholy mansion with signs of long neglect upon it. Great wooden shutters in the old-fashioned were barred outside. Across the windows, grass and even nettles were growing thick on the courtyard, and a thin moss streaked the timber beams. The plaster was discolored by time and weather and bore great russet and yellow stains. The gloom was increased by several grand old trees that crowded close about the house. I mounted the steps and looked round. The dark lake lay near me now, a little to the left. It was not large, may have covered some 10 or 12 acres, but it added to the melancholy of the scene. Near the center of it was a small island with two old ash trees leaning toward each other, their pensive images reflected in the stirless water. The only cheery influence of this scene of antiquity, solitude, and neglect was that the house and landscape were warmed with the ruddy western beams. I knocked, and my summons resounded hollow and ungenial in my ear. And the bell from far away returned a deep-mouthed and surly ring, as if it resented being roused from a score years' slumber. A light-limbed, jolly-looking old fellow in a Baroccan jacket and gaiters, with a smirk of welcome and a very sharp red nose that seemed to promise good cheer, opened the door with a promptitude that indicated a hospitable expectation of my arrival. There was but little light in the hall, and that little lost itself in darkness in the background. It was very spacious and lofty, with a gallery running round it, which, when the door was open, was visible at 2 or 3 points. Almost in the dark, my new acquaintance led me across this wide hall into the room destined for my reception. It was spacious and wainscoted up to the ceiling. The furniture of this capacious chamber was old-fashioned and clumsy. There were curtains still to the windows, and a piece of Turkey carpet lay upon the floor. Those windows were 2 in number, looking out through the trunks of the trees close to the house upon the lake. It needed all the fire and all the pleasant associations of my entertainer's red nose to light up this melancholy chamber. A door at its farther end admitted to the room that was prepared for my sleeping apartment. It was wainscoted like the other. It had a 4-post bed, with heavy tapestry curtains, and in other respects was furnished in the same old-world and ponderous style as the other room. Its window, like those of that apartment, looked out upon the lake. Somber and sad as these rooms were, they were yet scrupulously clean. I had nothing to complain of, but the effect was rather dispiriting. Having given some directions about supper, a pleasant incident to look forward to, and made a rapid toilet, I called in my friend with the gaiters and red nose, Tom Windsor, whose occupation was that of bailiff or understeward of the property, to accompany me, as we still had an hour or so of sun and twilight and a walk over the grounds. It was a sweet autumn evening, and my guide, a hardy old fellow, strode at a pace that tasked me to keep up with. Among clumps of trees at the northern boundary of the domain, we lighted upon the little antique parish church. I was looking down upon it from an eminence, and the park wall interposed. But a little way down was a stile affording access to the road, and by this we approached the iron gate of the churchyard. I saw the church door open. The sexton was replacing his pick, shovel, and spade, with which he had just been digging a grave in the churchyard, in their little repository under the stone stair of the tower. He was a polite, shrewd little hunchback who was very happy to show me over the church. Among the monuments was one that interested me. It was erected to commemorate the very Squire Bowes from whom my 2 old maids had inherited the house and estate of Barwick. It spoke of him in terms of grandiloquent eulogy and informed the Christian reader that he had died in the bosom of the Church of England at the age of 71. I read this inscription by the parting beams of the setting sun, which disappeared behind the horizon just as we passed out from under the porch. 20 years since the squire died, said I, reflecting, as I loitered still in the churchyard. Aye, sir, 'twill be 20 year the 9th o' last month. And a very good old gentleman? Good-natured enough, and an easy gentleman he was, sir. I don't think while he lived he ever hurt a fly, acquiesced Tom Windsor. It ain't always easy saying what's in 'em, though, and what they may take or turn to afterward, and some of them sort, I think, goes mad. You don't think he was out of his mind? I asked. He? No, not he, sir. A bit lazy, mayhap. Like other old fellows, but a knew devilish well what he was about. Tom Windsor's account was a little enigmatical, but like old Squire Bowes, I was a bit lazy that evening and asked no more questions about him. We got over the stile upon the narrow road that skirts the churchyard. It is overhung by elms more than 100 years old, and in the twilight, which now prevailed, was growing very dark. As side by side we walked along this road, hemmed in by two loose stone-like walls, something running toward us in a zigzag line passed us at a wild pace, with a sound like a frightened laugh or a shudder. And I saw, as it passed, that it was a human figure. I may confess now that I was a little startled. The dress of this figure was in part white. I know I mistook it at first for a white horse coming down the road at a gallop. Tom Windsor turned about and looked after the retreating figure. "He'll be on his travels tonight," he said in a low tone. "Easy served with a bed, that lad be. 6 foot of dry peat or heath, or a nook in a dry ditch. That lad hasn't slept once in a house this 20 year, and never will, while grass grows." "Is he mad?" I asked. "Something that way, sir. He's an idiot, not be. We call him DICKON the Devil, because the devil is almost the only word that's ever in his mouth." It struck me that this idiot was in some way connected with the story of old Squire Bowes. "Queer things are told of him, I dare say," I suggested. "More or less, sir, more or less. Queer stories, some." 20 years since he slept in a house? That's about the time the squire died," I continued. "So'll be, sir, not very long after." "You must tell me all about that, Tom, tonight, when I can hear it comfortably after supper." Tom did not seem to like my invitation, and looking straight before him as we trudged on, he said, "You see, sir, the house has been quiet, and now it's been troubling folk inside the walls or not, all round the woods of Barwick this 10 year or more, and my old woman down there is clear against talking about such matters, and thinks it best, and so do I, to let sleeping dogs be." He dropped his voice toward the close of the sentence and nodded significantly. We soon reached a point where he unlocked a wicket in the park wall by which we entered the grounds of Barwick once more. The twilight deepening over the landscape, the huge and solemn trees, and the distant outline of the haunted house exercised a somber influence on me, which, together with the fatigue of a day of travel and the brisk walk we had had, disinclined me to interrupt the silence in which my companion now indulged. A certain air of comparative comfort on our arrival in great measure dissipated the gloom that was stealing over me. Although it was by no means a cold night, I was very glad to see some wood blazing in the grate, and a pair of candles aiding the light of the fire. It made the room look cheerful. A small table, with a very white cloth, and preparations for supper, was also a very agreeable object. I should have liked very well, under these influences, to have listened to Tom Windsor's story, but after supper I grew too sleepy to attempt to lead him to the subject, and after yawning for a time, I found there was no use in contending against my drowsiness. So I betook myself to my bedroom, and by 10 o'clock was fast asleep. What interruption I experienced that night I shall tell you presently. It was not much, but it was very odd. By next night I had completed my work at Barwick. From early morning till then I was so incessantly occupied in hard work that I had no time to think over the singular occurrence to which I have just referred. Behold me, however, at length once more seated at my little supper table, having ended a comfortable meal. It had been a sultry day, and I had thrown one of the large windows up as high as it would go. I was sitting near it with my brandy and water at my elbow, looking out into the dark. There was no moon, and the trees that are grouped about the house make the darkness round it supernaturally profound on such nights. "Tom," said I, so soon as the jug of hot punch I had supplied him with began to exercise its genial and communicative influence, "you must tell me who beside your wife and you and myself slept in the house last night." Tom, sitting near the door, set down his tumbler and looked at me askance, while you might count 7 without speaking a word. "Who else slept in the house?" he repeated very deliberately. "Not a living soul, sir." He looked hard at me, still evidently expecting something more. "That is very odd," I said, returning his stare and feeling really a little odd. You are sure you were not in my room last night? Not till I came to call you, sir, this morning. I can make oath of that. Well, said I, there was someone there. I can make oath of that. I was so tired I could not make up my mind to get up, but I was waked by a sound that I thought was someone flinging down the 2 tin boxes in which my papers were locked up violently on the floor. I heard a slow step on the ground, and there was light in the room, although I remember having put out my candle. I thought it must have been you who'd come in for my clothes and upset the boxes by accident. Whoever it was, he went out, and the light with him. I was about to settle again when, the curtain being a little open at the foot of the bed, I saw a light on the wall opposite, such as a candle from outside would cast if the door were very cautiously opening. I started up in the bed, drew the side curtain, and saw that the door was opening and emitting light from outside. It is close, you know, to the head of the bed. A hand was holding on the edge of the door and pushing it open, not a bit like yours, a very singular hand. Let me look at yours. He extended it for my inspection. Oh no, there's nothing wrong with your hand. This was differently shaped, fatter, and the middle finger was stunted and shorter than the rest, looking as if it had once been broken, and the nail was crooked like a claw. I called out, "Who's there?" The light and the hand were withdrawn, and I saw and heard no more of my visitor. So sure as you're a living man, that was him? Exclaimed Tom Windsor, his very nose growing pale, his eyes almost starting out of his head. Who? I asked. Old Squire Bowes. 'Twas his hand you saw. The Lord have mercy on us, answered Tom. The broken finger and the nail bent like a hoop. Well, for you, sir, he didn't come back when you called that time. You came here about the Miss DeMock's business, and he never meant they should have a foot of ground in Barwick. And he was making a will to give it away quite different, when death took him short. He never was uncivil to no one, but he couldn't abide them ladies. My mind misgave me when I heard 'twas about their business you were coming, and now you see how it is. He'll be at his old tricks again. With some pressure and a little more punch, I induced Tom Windsor to explain his mysterious illusions by recounting the occurrences which followed the old squire's death. Squire Bowes of Barwick died without making a will, as you know, said Tom. And all the folk round were sorry. That is to say, sir, sorry as folk will be for an old man that has seen a long tale of years, and has no right to grumble that death was knocked an hour too soon at his door. The squire was well liked. He was never in a passion or said a hard word, and he would not hurt a fly, and that made what happened after his decease the more surprising. The first thing these ladies did when they got the property was to buy stock for the park. It was not wise in any case to graze the land on their own account, but they little knew all they had to contend with. Before long, something went wrong with the cattle. First one and then another took sick and died, and so on, till the loss began to grow heavy. Then queer stories, little by little, began to be told. It was said first by one, then by another, that Squire Bowes was seen about evening time, walking just as he used to do when he was alive, among the old trees, leaning on his stick, and sometimes when he came up with the cattle, he would stop and lay his hand kindly like on the back of one of them, and that one was sure to fall sick next day and die soon after. No one ever met him in the park or in the woods, or ever saw him except a good distance off. But they knew his gait and his figure well, and the clothes he used to wear, and they could tell the beast he laid his hand on by its color, white or black, and that beast was sure to sicken and die. The neighbors grew shy of taking the path over the park, and no one liked to walk in the woods or come inside the bounds of Barwick, and the cattle went on sickening and dying as before. At that time there was one Thomas Pike, who had been a groom to the old squire, and he was in care of the place, and was the only one that used to sleep in the house. Tom was vexed, hearing these stories, which he did not believe the half on 'em, and more especial as he could not get man or boy to herd the cattle, all being afeard. So he wrote to Matlock in Derbyshire, for his brother, Richard Pike, a clever lad, and one that knew nowt o' the story of the old squire walking. Dick came, and the cattle was better. Folk said they could still see the old squire sometimes walking as before in openings of the wood, with his stick in his hand. But he was shy of coming nigh the cattle, whatever his reason might be, since Dick and Pike came, and he used to stand a long bit off looking at them, with no more stir in him than a trunk or one of the old trees, for an hour at a time, till the shape melted away little by little, like the smoke of a fire that burns out. Tom Pike and his brother Dickon, being the only living souls in the house, lay in the big bed in the servants' room, the house being fast barred and locked one night in November. Tom was lying next the wall, and he told me, as wide awake as ever, he was at noonday. His brother Dickon lay outside and was sound asleep. Well, as Tom lay thinking, with his eyes turned toward the door, it opened slowly, and who should come in but old Squire Bowes, his face looking as dead as he was in his coffin. Tom's very breath left his body and could not take his eyes off him, and he felt the hair raising up on his head. The squire came to the side of the bed and put his arms under Dickon and lifted the boy, in a dead sleep all the time, and carried him out so at the door. Such was the appearance of Tom Pike's eyes, and he was ready to swear to it anywhere. When this happened, the light, wherever it came from, all on a sudden went out, and Tom could not see his own hand before him. More dead than alive, he lay till daylight. Sure enough, his brother Dickon was gone. No sign of him could he discover about the house, and with some trouble he got a couple of the neighbors to help him to search the woods and grounds. Not a sign of him anywhere. At last, one of them thought of the island in the lake the little boat was moored to the old post at the water's edge. In they got, though, with some small hope of finding him there. Find him, nevertheless, they did, sitting under the big ash tree, quite out of his wits, and to all their questions he answered nothing but one cry, "Beau's the devil! See him, Beau's the devil!" An idiot they found him, and so he will be till God sets all things right. No one could ever give him to sleep under a roof tree more. He wanders from house to house while daylight lasts, and no one cares to lock the harmless creature in the workhouse. And folk would rather not meet him after nightfall, for they think where he is there may be worse things near. A silence followed Tom's story. He and I were alone in that large room. I was sitting near the open window, looking into the dark night air. I fancied I saw something white move across it, and I heard a sound like low talking that swelled into a discordant shriek. "Oh, Beau's the devil over your shoulder, oh, ha ha ha." I started up and saw, by the light of the candle with which Tom strode to the window, the wild eyes and blighted face of the idiot as, with a sudden change of mood, he drew off, whispering and tittering to himself, and holding up his long fingers and looking at them as if they were lighted at the tips like a hand of glory. Tom pulled down the window. The story and its epilogue were over. I confessed I was rather glad when I heard the sound of the horse's hoofs on the courtyard a few minutes later, and still gladder when, having bidden Tom a kind farewell, I had left the neglected house of Barwick a mile behind me. End of story. If you enjoyed this reading, please make sure to subscribe, hit that like button, and check out friendlyfrogpress.com, where you can see where our collection of eBooks, paperbacks, and audiobooks are available. Friendly Frog Press, where the classics come alive. This is Paul Beauheart, signing off.